To be honest, you're not going to hear about women at the well. I think people have heard enough about services. So I'm going to speak about one particular woman. So my task is addressing success and failures in the context of assisting resettlement of victims of human trafficking. I've scrapped my original presentation and chosen instead to share the experiences of women we are still supporting. Let's call her Kat. These experiences shared with you are shared not only with her permission, but actually in her own words. All I've done is edited them to fit into the time constraints. I am 54 years old. I was born in Budapest, Hungary. I'm separated from my husband. I have 2 daughters, both in their early 30s, living in Hungary with their families. I'm close to them and I try to speak with them every day. I'm a qualified generic nurse and worked in hospitals in Hungary for 8 years. I decided to leave Hungary because with the cuts to healthcare, it meant I couldn't earn enough to have a decent standard of living. I came first to London in 2011. I had applied for cleaning jobs via a Hungarian website that advertised a variety of different types of job in London. I funded my own travel, but found that most of the women I met there couldn't pay for their own travel and so were offered funding for their journeys. They were brought to London by car and so they were already in debt even before they entered the UK. They were then offered rented shared accommodation, which again was being paid for them by the same Hungarians that had brought them, so it was adding to the debt they owed for their transport. They were real cleaning jobs that we came to, but they were very low pay, and it made it impossible to pay for somewhere to live, food, etc. I found out that the women who were already in debt before they even started working in cleaning were immediately offered work in brothels to help with their finances. They could say no, but because most of them are single mothers with more than one child back at home in Hungary, being looked after by their grandmother, understandably, they tended to say yes. This has become so normal to survival that we now have an email group with women who've applied for these cleaning jobs via the website for women to get them into work in prostitution whenever they have financial difficulties. So whenever I faced financial hardship myself, I just popped an email and received phone numbers immediately. Most brothels I worked in were operated by Hungarian Roma women. Usually these madams had a partner, Irish, Polish and Jamaican men, never Hungarian. The boss was always the woman. The men were there just to intimidate prostituted women in case they misbehaved. On one occasion, I was threatened by one of these men. If I didn't behave, I'd be buried under the floor. I felt constantly in fear of death while being in that brothel. In that particular brothel, the windows were covered with shutters which were locked. No one was allowed out. The clients were, of course, aware of the level of coercion, but they didn't seem to care. I eventually managed to escape via a window at night, which happened to be open after a client complained about the lack of air. The madam and her partner were passed out due to drug use. That's when I climbed out of the window and ran. I always tried to find a way to get out of a brothel as soon as possible after sensing violence and coercion. The brothels were in private rented houses or flats, usually in residential areas. There were too many brothels to count because the madam often changed locations in order to avoid detection by the police. We were not only working but also living there. When a brothel moved, we were moved with it, not knowing where we were going to go, but unable to refuse to go with them. Depending on the size of the house, in some there were 13 of us, sometimes there were just 2 to 5 women. All the women I met were Hungarian, mainly Roma, except one African and 2 Eastern European women. We always had to give 50% of our earnings to the madam. The charge to the men ranged between £60 and £90 per hour, and we were expected to make a minimum of £200 to £300 a day for the madam. In most places, the madam asked for our passports, ID cards. I always managed never to hand mine over, but was still allowed to stay. Most did give their ID, not aware of the problems it would lead to. The hygiene was awful, the brothels didn't have baths. Quite often there may be only one bathroom, which included the use of the clients. In another brothel, a young Roma woman who made the most money wanted to leave. She was made dependent on drugs, cocaine, so didn't want to leave anymore. I eventually realised this brothel was a drug distribution point as well, because I noticed one of the cupboards was full of tiny plastic bags, the one that drugs are distributed in, and I saw a small set of scales. Some of the women were literally being sold and bought. When a madam or pimp lost money with gambling, they paid with the woman, or on one occasion with a whole brothel. The madam herself, a Roma woman, boasted about it in one of the brothels. In another, a young Roma woman in her 20s told me when she was still an adolescent girl in Hungary, she was sold and forced into prostitution in London. Now, Nora, our worker who is Hungarian, said that Kat didn't know how the woman got from Hungary to London, but it looked like she'd been sold to pay off usury. And in Hungarian Roma culture, in the countryside, usury is still very much present. If someone can't pay, female members of the family are sold into prostitution. It's also interesting to note that the brothels were mostly operated by Roma women. It's possible that these women were prostituted themselves before this, and this was their way out. I go back to Kat's story. After 2 years in 2013, I registered as a self-employed cleaner. From this time up until 2016, I managed to work as a full-time cleaner and stay out of brothels. I worked at least 40 hours a week and earned between £1,000 and £2,000 a month. I had a Hungarian bookkeeper working in London and was always up to date with my tax returns. This period was the first and only time I lived in a room in a private rented shared accommodation, which I paid for myself, but I didn't have a rent book. In 2016, I planned to go to Hungary for 4 days to have a holiday, but my mother, whom I'm not close to, fell ill, so I stayed for a year. When I returned to London, I came with only £20. My plan was to live with my ex-boyfriend, a Jamaican man, who offered to let me stay with him, but by the time I arrived, he had a new girlfriend who didn't want me around. A solution he offered was to pimp me out. I left him. With no money and nowhere else to stay, I ended up in a brothel again. Circumstances were inhumane, so I left and ended up sleeping on the streets. So I end her version, and I move to what Nora said. So Kat had been sleeping on the streets for 2 days when she found her, and we were asked to become involved by another organisation because they couldn't communicate with her. Nora met her that first evening, and first of all, she reassured her that she wouldn't be spending another night on the streets. She got her something to eat, and she spent the next 2.5 hours trying to find somewhere for her to stay. It's not really a very good idea to be looking for accommodation on a Friday evening in London in the middle of the Wimbledon final weekend, because every bed has been booked up for months. But we managed it, and we put her in a backpacker's hostel. We continued to pay for Kat's accommodation and material needs for over 4 months, during which time she met with Nora each day as she tried to unravel her case. The fact that it took that long was due to complexity, but actually it was compounded by the failures of the state and failures of the systems that have been set up to support women such as Kat. And we will challenge that. But we actually only got Kat into her own accommodation today. Kat indicated at the beginning that the plight of the women she met within the brothels were horrendous to her, and what she wanted to do was help to get those places closed down. We've not done anything about that yet, because until she was safe, nothing could be done. But we have verified the websites. We know exactly how the women are recruited, and the work with the police will begin from today to ensure that that happens. Because Kat was paying tax while she was working, we have been able to get her accommodation and to get her benefits. But that wouldn't be true for most of the other women in those brothels, because they will have no rights. Not only do they not have rights, but in addition to that, because of their previous life experiences, they do not trust the authorities. They're unlikely to cooperate enough to get them any accommodation or to access any rights that they might have under legislation. If they return to Hungary, their problems would be compounded, partly because they're Roma and the discrimination against the Roma people in Hungary is so bad. But in addition to that, there are no support services at all, other than that are run by the pro-prostitution lobby. What have we learnt? We've learnt it's important to communicate directly in their own language with women. We've had bad experiences in the past where the interpreters have been very judgmental about prostitution, and it's caused problems. It's essential to have a practical approach. Partly, the fact that we have independent funding allowed us to pay for hotels, which wouldn't normally be the case. Also, because we stand outside of the state system, we're not restricted to the services that they allow us to have. It's important to work at a speed and time frame dictated by the woman. She wanted somewhere to live, but she also identified the need to learn English. So despite the fact that we hadn't resolved her situation, we began English classes straight away in order to enable her to feel her future was beginning. It's important that all services are trauma-informed. The layers of trauma the women have experienced need to be recognised and worked with. It's important to have an honest, robust working relationship with the police. We cannot possibly begin to unpack challenging the situations in those brothels unless we have a situation of trust and we know that she herself will be safe. But most important of all, perhaps, is that underpinning this is the realisation that women move through many different definitions of their status. Kat moved through being an economic migrant and trapped within prostitution, being a victim of modern slavery and a victim of trafficking. It takes time and patience to unravel these complexities and provide appropriate trauma-informed support as the women relives the traumas. Long-term resettlement, reintegration and exit from the sex trade, regardless of how you entered into it, is always complex, a complex, arduous journey. And the great emotional resilience and resolve to be required to relive the myriad of past traumas should never, ever be underestimated. And we owe a huge debt to the women here who are prepared to share those experiences with us. And we should never, ever think that those are easily done. Thank you particularly, Rachel, for your sharing a moment ago.